Over in Toronto today, the Ford government has released its fall fiscal update, and the message to Ontarians appears to be things are going to be kind of different for now. The CBC's Mike Crawley joins us to explain from Queen's Park. Hey, Mike, great to see you. So the government appears to have reversed course, at least a little bit, from the budget we can all remember back in the spring that set off a lot of sort of feelings of people not being too happy, I guess you could say, with a number of the decisions made in that budget. What are they doing instead this time?
Well, what the Ford government is doing really is they're simply just putting some of the spending cuts that they were going to make back onto the province's books. So this is the document. It's the fiscal update, mid-year fiscal update, and it shows an increase in spending if you compare it with the spring budget, but really it's just accounting. They're accounting for walking back some of their cuts, because think about it this way. When you put in the budget that you're going to cut spending and then you change your mind, the mid-year update makes it look like you're spending more money. So look, the Ford government wants Ontarians to believe that it's kind of seeing the light, that it's changing its ways, it's changing its tone, turning over a new leaf, trying to start a new era, let's say. You should remember that Doug Ford did demote the finance minister who tabled that budget back in the spring. So what we heard today was a statement from the new finance minister. That's Rod Phillips.
You know, we listened to Ontarians. We listened to what they thought was working well in the plan that we had, and we listened as well to the concerns that they had. So you can expect that this is a government that is going to listen and continue to listen and make sure that we make adjustments as we go along.
So that's an example of the new tone that the Ford government is trying to hit. Rod Phillips said that the government is beating its deficit targets. Again, that all depends on where you set your targets at. If you inflate the deficit, it's easier to beat your target. Another reason why they're beating their targets is revenues are just rolling into this government. They'd kind of underestimated how much corporate tax revenue they're going to bring in this year by $1 billion. So that's one reason why he was actually able to lower the projected deficit for this year.
On the difference, Mike, in tone or the difference in this update versus the last budget, is it more than, as the opposition charges, just putting these cuts on hold, or is that all that they're doing?
Well, look, this is still an austerity budget. And when you look through this document, the ministries, almost every ministry is still facing a spending cut. And even the ones that are increasing, things like healthcare and education, it's not an actual increase if you account for things like population growth and inflation. So per person in real dollars, this government isn't increase in spending. They are aiming to try to balance the budget by 2023, and they're definitely going to be helped in that by the increase in revenues in this growing economy. Vashi?
All right, thanks, Mike. Appreciate that update. Rod Phillips is the Ontario Minister of Finance. He joins us now from Queen's Park in Toronto. Hi, Minister Phillips. Great to have you back on the show.
Hi, Vashi. Great to be back on the show.
$1.3 billion of spending in this update that was cut out of the budget. The opposition says all you're doing is putting these cuts on hold. Do they have a point?
You know, Vashi, we're going to be spending more, particularly in the areas like healthcare and education, than has ever been spent in Ontario. We're spending $1.9 billion more in healthcare over last year, $1.2 billion more in education, as you pointed out, more as a result of this fiscal update. And those changes are a result of the fact that we've been listening to Ontarians, we've been listening to the areas of concern, making sure we make investments where we need to. As you mentioned as well, we've been able to reduce our deficit by $1.3 billion versus our projection. So we're going in the right direction towards balancing our budget as well. But, you know, governing is about balancing those priorities. And we think those investments, along with that path to balancing the budget, along with the tax cuts that we have been able to already carry out, are the things that Ontarians want to see us doing as a government.
But it's not really more money. I mean, this is money that was cut out of the budget last year. I'm thinking, for example, of things that the government walked back, like cutting $67 million for the Transition Children Benefit, canceling $28 million budget cut to Children's Aid Society, walking back cuts for kids living with autism and doubling funding to create a new autism funding system, canceling mid-year cuts to public health, and backtracking on plans to increase class sizes. The opposition is asking of your government whether all that stuff is just being pushed ahead a couple of years. Is it?
No, Vashi, it actually is more money, and I appreciate, the opposition's job is to say what they say. But in the case of healthcare, for example, and you mentioned a couple of areas there that touch on healthcare, we're spending $1.9 billion more than the last budget, $400 million more than our original budget, the 2019 budget. In the case of education, it's $200 million more, and as I said, $1.2 billion more than the previous year. So clearly,
but those initial
those
ones,
are
with
increases.
respect, those initial increases that you're talking about were still a lot smaller than had been projected before. So there were already going to be an impact to the decisions you're making. You just reverse some of the impact.
I'm not sure when people talk, and I know it's the opposition, talk about what's been projected before, what I have to look at as finance minister is what was actually spent. So our government is spending $1.9 billion more than was spent in the last year that was partly the Liberal government and partly ourselves, $1.2 billion more in education than was spent before. So those are clearly increases. In the case of education, almost a 4% increase. So, obviously the opposition has their narrative. We're listening. We obviously listen to Ontarians. We listen to the things that were working well with regards to our plan. We also listen to the places where they were looking for added investment. You mentioned autism, $279 million more dollars in autism. That makes our Ontario Autism Program the best funded autism program in the country at $600 million. So, these are changes that make sense. We're going to keep listening to people in Ontario, and of course, we're going to keep on track to make sure that we balance the budget as well. We do have significant financial issues here. We're the largest sovereign debtor in the world, so we do have to make sure that we get to that balanced budget in 2023.
You highlighted, for example, the funding for autism. That decision to increase the funding came after months of parents, loudly and with much emotion talking about the impact that the decisions your government had originally made would have on their families and on their kids. You say that you're listening now. Why weren't you listening prior to? Why wasn't your government listening prior to the introduction of your first budget that created so much of this chaos?
In the case of parents with autism, we have been listening for over a year. We have our autism panel that provided recommendations, and we are going to make sure that we have that needs-based program that parents have been talking about. Again, we're going to be concerned about getting the best outcomes for the children and for the families of children with autism. And as I said, we now will have the best funded program, the best resource program, and I think with the kind of professionals we have working in the space, the best program for the kids here in Ontario. So, we're going to listen. As I said, we're going to make changes where we need to make them. We do have to balance a number of priorities, and of course, one of them is making sure we make those kind of investments that we're supporting our most vulnerable, just like we're supporting healthcare and education with that increased spending.
With respect, though, I'd imagine those families are wondering why you weren't listening, why your government wasn't listening last April.
Well, I've had the chance to speak with many of the parents of children with autism in my riding of Ajax and out in Durham, and what they want is a program that's based on the needs of their children. They've been, quite clear that the program that existed under the previous Liberal government was not working either. So, we're now working, and again, the Autism Advisory Panel, which included parents, caregivers, a number of the professionals in the area have given us their best advice. Minister Todd Smith is looking at that advice and looking at how we can apply it in the best possible way. And again, with now $600 million, which is more than double the budget of the last government, to make sure that we deliver that service and we support those children.
Before I let you go, Minister, there was a section in this update that talked about strengthening the federal-provincial relationship. Of course, that's of interest to a lot of our viewers who are watching what's happening in Ottawa right now. You spoke about the transfers from the federal government to the provincial government, as well as the amount of tax money or money that goes from Ontario into federal coffers. We've heard from other premiers and other governments in this country that they want to revisit the equalization formula. Is that what the Ontario government is looking for as well?
Premier Ford has already spoken, as you know, to Prime Minister Trudeau. We are hopeful and optimistic about a very positive relationship with this new government. We have a lot of shared priorities. We have our landmark transit deal that Premier Ford made with John Tory. That's going to require federal government support, so we're going to work with them. Now, when it comes to the amount of money that Ontario provides to Ottawa, we don't want to miss an opportunity to remind people that $12 billion, which, as you know, just happens to also be the interest that we pay each year on our debt. But $12 billion of revenue flows from Ontario to Ottawa, more money than comes back. So, those are just the realities. But I think that that the Premier, working with the other premiers, working with the Prime Minister, I think our Premier can be a very positive force in terms of making sure that the Federation works. He has great relationships with the other premiers, and we're very optimistic about at least that initial conversation with Prime Minister Trudeau.
With respect, Minister Phillips, that didn't answer the question about where your government stands on the equalization formula. Do you want to see it changed?
We're going to always be open to whatever discussions, but right now we're focused on the priorities that we have with the federal government. We'd like them to increase the escalator on healthcare to 5.3% a year. We'd like them to make sure that they fund the 350 infrastructure projects that we've approved. I mentioned the subway project already. We have other priorities, particularly to do with competitiveness in our country. So we're going to focus on that agenda, and of course we'll be open to what other premiers and what the Prime Minister want to talk about as well.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Minister Phillips. Appreciate your time this evening, as always.
Our government, Mr. Speaker, has adopted a balanced and prudent approach to governing. Our commitments are what we balance against, and our commitments are to put more money back into people's pockets. Our commitment is to make sure that we invest in essential public services, and our commitment is to make sure that we return Ontario to sound financial footing.
Today in Ontario, the Ford government released, as you heard there, its mini budget, or what's more formally known as the fall fiscal update. And it's a change from its first budget released last spring, which of course triggered months of backlash. Here are some of the highlights. The provincial government is committing to $1.3 billion in extra spending. That includes $279 million more for autism services and $310 million more for social assistance, which includes the child benefit that was supposed to be scrapped. The government is also cutting the small business tax rate from 3.5% to 3.2%. All of that adds up to a deficit of about $9 billion this year, still less than the $10.3 billion the government had projected for the year. But the government isn't walking back all of its planned cuts. So how is the official opposition reacting? Andrea Horwath is the leader of the Ontario NDP. She joins us now from Queen's Park in Toronto. Hi, Ms. Horwath. Nice to see you. Thanks for making time for us.
My pleasure, Vashi. Thank you.
Minister Phillips in his press conference said today that we listened to Ontarians. We listened to what they thought was working well, and we listened as well to the concerns that they had. Is this budget proof, or is this update rather, proof that they did listen?
No, in fact, all this $1.3 billion is a softening of their previous cuts, a backtracking on some of their cuts, delaying of some of their cuts, but really the cuts are still coming. No nurse is going to be back at work at the hospitals that's been laid off. The 10,000 teachers are still going to be exiting our education system. Really this fall economic update is just a delaying of the cuts that they announced in their last budget.
How do you know for sure, Ms. Horwath, that that's the case? For example, the teachers that you're referencing there, a lot of that had to do with class sizes, and at least in the instance where they're negotiating with secondary school teachers, they're saying that now they're willing to cap the class sizes at 25, not 28, which would result in fewer teachers who lose their job.
Well, in fact, what they've said is that they're going to get rid of caps altogether, which sends off the alarm bells, and those negotiations have not come to fruition. But, it's pretty
When did they
clear.
say they were getting rid of caps altogether?
This is what's on the bargaining table as far as I'm concerned. This is what they've been saying all along with the teachers, is that they're going to get rid of the caps, and it's something that the teachers unions don't want to see, because that means that the class sizes can balloon to any extent whatsoever. But look, those things are still out for negotiations. We don't know where those things are going to end up, but what we do know is this $1.3 billion is not new spending. It is the backtracking of the cuts that the government has made to some extent, softening some of those cuts, but certainly it is not a new leaf being turned by this government. It's not a new direction being set out by this government. It's the same as last time, and in fact what we've seen is that they're doing the same kind of strategy as they did with their budget, which is pretending that this is kinder and gentler, pretending that this is about investments and new spending, which is what they pretended in their initial budget last spring. It's not true, and what they've even inflated the deficit numbers again to try to I guess justify some of the cuts that are going to be delayed until next year. But the cuts are still coming, and people are still going to be waiting in hallways for days on end attend to get seen in emergencies in hospitals. They're still going to be seeing their kids not being able to get the courses that they need to graduate. They're still going to see, as I said, education support workers and teachers being laid off and fired.
You're right. This isn't new spending. This is stuff that they took away in the budget, and now that they are reversing it. But isn't that what should happen? I mean, shouldn't they have made that decision to reverse those cuts since the impact, what you and your colleagues talked about so often, the negative impact of those initial decisions was there? Like, why is it a bad thing that they have decided to change course on cuts that they initially announced?
Well, I would be careful to say that it's a reversal. Many of these things are simply delays. They're delaying the cuts to the public health units. They're delaying the cuts to the ambulance system. So there's no indication that they've had a full reversal in any of these instances. And in fact, in some cases, there's even more cuts. There's more cuts to Indigenous affairs in this economic statement. There's more cuts to legal aid funding in this fall economic update. So the cuts are still there. Some of them are delayed. We'll see if any of them are fully reversed. You mentioned the autism funding. You know, they talk about that in the statement, but in the expenditure estimates, that money is not there. The expenditure estimates, as you know, are what's actually budgeted to be spent in this fiscal year by the government. They don't exist in the expenditure estimates, and so it might be a bit of smoke and mirrors that the minister's trying to play here, which is what we're used to now with this government.
The justification that they have long put forth and that they did again today for looking at the expenditure side of things, the spending side of things, is the size of the debt, right? The province's net debt will reach an estimated $353 billion by the end of 2019-2020. It's one of the biggest line items servicing that debt in the budget right now. How would you tackle it any differently? I mean, would you not even look at the spending side of things? Do you agree that that is a problem, the amount of money people in this province spend servicing the debt rather than putting it towards program spending?
Well, you know what I wouldn't do, Vashi? I wouldn't be cutting revenues, and that's again what this government has done. They did it in the budget that they put forward last spring, and they're doing it again in this financial update.
Aren't they trying to help small businesses though with this rate cut?
I was just going to say, when I talk to small businesses, they tell me they want their hydro rates reduced, that they want a sustainable electricity system that reduces their rates over time, and that they can rely on those rates being lower. They want a skilled workforce available for them to be able to be able to grow their companies and have the labor force that they need. They need a reduction in the gridlock on our roads so that they can get their goods to market. These are the things that small businesses tell me that they need. But look, I also wouldn't be giving tax cuts to the wealthy, which is what they did in the spring as well. Those resources are necessary to do things like fix our hallway medicine problem in Ontario. Those resources are necessary to make sure our education system is top of the line and is able to create opportunity for our young people as they grow in our province. And so I would have different priorities than this government has, for sure.
So does that mean that you would reverse, for example, the small business tax rate cut?
Well, again, when I talk to small businesses, that's not what they were telling me was their priority. But this is the government that believes that taxes are evil and that government should be small and that people should fend for themselves. They don't believe that it's their job to help people. I disagree. I think that's.
They would argue they're trying to help small business in this case, though, right?
Well,
that's
but what I would say is that what we need to do is make sure that government is providing the basic services that people need. Things like a healthcare system they can rely on where and when they need it. Things like long-term care beds to try to take the pressure off hospitals. Things like funding to hospitals to try to get the hallway medicine crisis dealt with. It's not helpful when the government's cutting taxes for the rich and reducing the ability to help everyday people build a good life in our province.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, Ms. Horvath. Really appreciate your time this evening, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.